They went down to New Orleans to pick up supplies for Fort Pitt. On the way back up the Ohio River, they came to the sandbar here at Dayton. And they thought, well, here's a good place to park for the night and camp. And as they were coming off of their rafts on shore, they looked up the river, and out of the Little Miami, they saw Indian canoes coming out. And they thought, well, this is a chance to capture some Indians, get a few scalps that we get paid for at Fort Washington. They got paid $5 for an Indian scalp. If you had an ear attached, you got a little more. But at any rate, they crept up through the willows, and they thought, well, we're going to get these Indians. But what they didn't know was 200 Indians were waiting for them. They were ambushed. All but about 10 survived. Two of the survivors, one was a Captain Benham. He was shot in both hips and managed to pull himself up into a fallen tree and hide while the Indians stripped the rest of the party. The other man was shot in both arms. He could walk, but he couldn't pick up anything. So he crawled under a fallen log and hid there. After a couple of days, they felt safe enough that they could contact each other, and one fired a shot at some wild game, and he heard somebody say, hey, and he thought, well, maybe it's an Indian. He wasn't sure. Well, finally, they convinced each other that they were both Kentuckians from the same party, got together, and the way they survived for 6 weeks in this vicinity was the man with the good arms would shoot the wild game, and there was an abundance of it around him. And the fellow with the good legs would go over and he would rake it over to him with his feet. And that's the way they existed for 6 weeks. When they needed water, the man with the good legs, the fellow with the good arms, would stick his hat upside down in his mouth. He'd wade out into the river and come back with a hat full of water. And they finally made it back to Fort Washington. And Captain Benham was a career Army man. He went on to be a quite famous Indian fighter in the West. And I am quite sure Benham Street in Dayton, Kentucky is probably named after him. Because when he retired from the Army, he came back to this area and became the first magistrate for the city of Newport. Now, talk about the era that we were in at that time. See, Dayton was founded, the first Jamestown settlement in 1848 by Governor Bramlage, when he was commissioned by, or rather he was petitioned by 3 men from Dayton, James MacArthur, Henry Walker, and Washington Berry, to form a city consisting of 159 acres. A year later, almost to the day, the city of Brooklyn was formed by the same token. A petition was filed in Frankfort, and they were granted a charter to form a city which they called Brooklyn. The two towns existed side by side. Now here we see on the map is a map of Brooklyn and Jamestown in 1859. Everything west of Berry Avenue, only 1 block wide, was Brooklyn. Everything east of Berry, all the way to Tacoma Park, as we knew it, was Jamestown. They existed side by side until 1867, when Jamestown applied for a post office. Brooklyn had one, but Jamestown wanted a post office. They applied for it. The federal government told them that we're sorry, but there is already a city in Kentucky by the name of Jamestown which has the post office. You cannot have a post office. Well, the two towns got together, and they were so much alike in social affairs and the kind of work they did, because most of them worked on the steamboats in some manner, shape, or fashion. And they voted to form the city of Dayton in 1867. And that's how Dayton came about. But it was a very colorful period. This was a period when we had ladies with the big hoop skirts, the big flowery hats, long white gloves, and we had the famous entertainers like George M. Cohan and Eddie Foy and Diamond Lil, and they came out with songs like Let Me Call You Sweetheart and After the Ball Is Over. Those were in that period. The steamboats, which were really the era that we grew out of, were built across the river at a little community called Fulton, Ohio, right on Eggleston Avenue, as we know it today. Or not Eggleston, but Eastern Avenue. There were 900 steamboats built in the Fulton shipyards across from Dayton, from the period of 1818 to 1880. One of those ships was the, trying to think of it now, the famous one that, oh, I know what it was the Natchez. The Natchez. The one that raced the Robert E. Lee was built in 1867 in the Bolton shipyards. Many other famous boats were built over there. We got a lot of our everyday expressions from that period of time. You know, on the top of the steamship stacks looked like crowns. They were called flutes, and those were filters to filter the hot ash and the soot, so that if you were on the top deck, you didn't get burned or didn't get too dirty anyway. And so when you said you were going to take a trip on the steamboat, and back in those days, and only the most influential people usually could afford to ride the steamboats, they say, oh, you're going out with the highfaluters. And that's where we got that term expression. And of course, they took great pride in the stacks of the steamboats. The taller they were, the better they were. And they'd look up and down the river, and some guys would comment and say, boy, she's well stacked. Of course, that isn't what we use it for today. But that was what they did back then. The wheel on the steamboat turns on not an axle, which most of us would think, but it's called a whack. Now, when they would strike an obstruction in the river, the captain would yell out, all hands on deck, she's gone whacking. So we got that term. That's just a few of the things. On the steamboat was introduced on the J.M. White, probably one of the most luxurious steamboats of the area, the first flush toilet in America. 6,000 people came down to the public landing in 1871 to see this new contraption that was on the steamboat. First flush toilet in America. Packaged cigarettes were introduced on the steamboat, first time in America. People used to roll their own, you know, and finally somebody got the idea, well, we'll roll them for them and package them and sell them. And that's what they did on the steamboat. Well, then they get on the top deck and try to light those cigarettes with a stick match. Well, if you ever tried that, that's an art in itself. So book matches were invented at that time specifically for the passengers on the steamboat, because you could fold that book, hold it in your hand, and light your cigarette safely. But to get back to the Dayton, but that tells you about the era that this town grew out of. We had steam fitters, we had carvers, we had carpenters. All of them worked on those steamboats. We had 8 rope walks. Now, what is a rope walk? It made the big, thick rope for the steamboats. We had 8 of them here in Dayton, Kentucky. And they grew the hemp for those ropes right in the hillside. Of course, back then they didn't know they could smoke it. But they used it for the steamboats to build the rope. Of course, when cotton and steel came out, hemp went out the door. And that was the end of our rope walk, so to speak. The last semblance of a rope walk in Dayton, Kentucky was when we tore down Mottry's bowling lane building. That was the original rope walk building of the Victoria, Cordage, or Bonte's rope walk. They built in something like 1880. Between Berry Avenue and Tacoma Park, in the middle of the river, at one time there was a wooded island. And when you came down the river, you either took this side of the island or you took the Ohio side of the island. Of course, that's long since been gone. We had 3 hotels on Front Street in Dayton. One at the foot of Clay was called the Jamestown, the Union, and the Torchlight. They were all about a block apart. There were wharfs all along that riverfront in Jamestown. And when you came up the river and you tied up for the night, you could come ashore and get a nice bed. You could take a nice shower, take a bath. On the steamboat, you didn't have that luxury. You were lucky. You usually slept on a bale of hay, and there wasn't any bathing facilities. So Dayton was quite active in that period by furnishing lodging and baths for steamboat passengers. We had a ferry boat. The first public enterprise the city of Dayton ever engaged in. It was called the John Hastings. And it was parked at the foot of Berry Avenue, and everybody that worked in the shipyards would put their toll blocks on their shoulder and walk down the foot of Berry and jump on the John Hastings and go across to work. And in the evening, they came back the same way. Many of our homes today in Dayton a few of them, if you ever notice, they have a tower, a big tower, and then they have, looks like a little fence around the top of it. Well, those are called widows' walks, and for that reason, you could usually figure that somebody in the steamboat business lived in that house. It was usually a captain, because they could only afford that kind of a home usually. And the lady, when she figured it was about time for her husband to come home for supper, she'd get up on the top of that roof in a little enclosed fence and put a field glass up there, and she'd look up and down the river, see her husband's steamboat coming up the river, and she knew it's time to go down there and prepare supper. Now, in New England, they have the same thing, except in New England, if you ever have a chance to go up there, they are glass-enclosed towers. The reason for that is the severe weather of the Atlantic coast, and they call those captain's walks. The widow's walks are the open-air ones. First train came through Dayton in 1888. I will show you a picture of that in a minute. First streetcar was in 1891 when the C&O Bridge was opened for the first time. Buses replaced the streetcars in 1939. Our city buildings, the earliest city meeting that we had was down on Front Street in a fellow's home called Thomas Hoskins. And he rented the city a room for 25 cents for the night. And that's where our first city minutes, our city fathers met. They then met at the corner of 4th and Main. There used to be a saloon there on the corner. It's a vacant lot now. Then they moved into the KFP building, which we're all familiar with, which is the carpet place today. They were on the second floor. I have pictures of council in session there in 1898. Also, the school board also met there. And from 1908 to 1920, the city offices were in that apartment building next to my office, 720 6th Avenue. Then they moved back to the KFP building. 1928, the school board donated that 6th Street Elementary School to the city for their city building, which it is today. We had all kinds of private industry here, not only rope walks, but we had home cigar factories. People made cigars in their homes and packaged them and sold them. We had brick yards. There was a brick yard at the foot of Clark Street, one at the foot of Walnut Street, one along 4th between Vine and Berry, or not Vine and Berry, but Vine and McKinney. Sawmills, grist mills, and of course the hemp industry was quite thriving. They grew the hemp in the hillsides up there. There were tailor shops. Mashnot and Centner had a tailor shop right here in 1923. You'll see a picture of that building. Let's see. School enrollment. 1897, we had 991 children enrolled in the school, 2/3 of which were in the 4th grade. We had a high school of 35 in the whole high school. And the first high school was in Lincoln School. In 1888, they organized the first high school. It was a 3-year high school. It only went 3 years back in those days. And it was there until 1904 when they built the 8th Street School, which burned in 1924. We had a night high school. I bet you a lot of you didn't know we had one of those. From 1918 to 1928, we had a night high school of over 100 pupils. I have a picture of the first graduating class in 1922. Felix Breitenstein was one of those graduates. Lincoln School, the old school, was built in 1871. First high school, of course, I said, was formed in 88 in that same building. The building burned in 1952. We had an early school, supposedly, at the head of 7th and Berry. I've never been able to find any proof of that, except in the old Grand Army of the Republic souvenir book, which it does mention it. And, of course, the 6th Street Elementary School was the other one. So let's go on with the slides, and then I'll tell you a little bit more as we go along. If somebody will turn the projector's already on. Looks like we're ready to go. Somebody got the lights? Or, oh, they're already out. Okay. It's going to be a little hard in here, I guess. As I said, this is a map of Jamestown and Brooklyn. This is the dividing line between the two cities, right there. That's a map of Dayton in 1883. Going to be hard to see. I don't know what we can do there. What can we do? You got to have light, don't you? Is that better? Okay, all right. There's a tract of land here on 6th between Vine and Terrace, which was owned by Dr. Pythian of Newport. He owned all the way from 6th Avenue to the river. He built a big, fine home right here, opposite what we know today as 4th and Terrace. He sold that in 1888 to the Dayton Lot Home and Development Company, whose president was William Tiemann. And they subdivided it and built in the 1890s, the early 1890s, all of 4th Street between Terrace and Vine. Now, 5th Street was not developed until in the early 20s. That was later to come. The rope walk is, let me see, this is here. Can't see it on this thing. Here's the rope walk. That stretched all the way from 7th and Main down to 4th and Clay. That's the John Hastings, the first ferry boat. This is an early Dayton beach scene. The Grand Army of the Republic picked this area, Dayton and Bellevue, and the Cincinnati area in 1898 as the place for their annual convention of Union veterans because they felt that Dayton and Bellevue had the finest bathing beaches in the Midwest. There wasn't anything comparable to it. You'd have as many as 4,000 and 5,000 during the week, maybe 7,000 and 8,000 on a weekend on those beaches. That's another beach scene about the turn of the century. That's Tacoma Beach, 1940. That was the last surviving beach that we had. This is the Bellevue Beach, Queen City Beach. They had a big, beautiful pavilion, 2 blocks long, two stories high, and that's up here, this pavilion. And here you can see it better. They had their canoe rentals, bathing suit rentals on the lower level. This was a dance hall on the 2nd level, the top floor with private dining rooms for private meetings and so forth. Now you say, what happened to our beaches? Well, 3 things killed the beaches. One was the cities began dumping the pollution into the river. Because prior to that, you could walk halfway out in the Ohio River up to your waist and look down and see your feet. You can't do that now, not even today. Second was the beaches were all privately owned, each block. There was the Queen City Beach, the Primrose, the Manhattan, the Berlin, the Gem, and the Tacoma Beach. Those were to name a few of them. What happened was people would get down there, horse playing and get hurt. First thing they do, sue the beach owner. The suits got so often and the insurance got so expensive, they couldn't handle it, so they just shut down. The other thing was that the Corps of Engineers came along and put in the bank at Fern Bank, the dams at Fern Bank, and a couple other dams along the river, raised the pool stage 9 feet, wiped out about half the beaches at that point. So that's why we don't have beaches today. This is our first public transportation in Dayton. That's the old steam dummy right there. It went at a fantastic speed of something like 4 or 5 miles an hour. You can almost walk that fast. This is the first electrified streetcar of Dayton's in 1891. Of course, all the dignitaries are standing there in front. You got the bunny and electric lights say Dayton across the front of it. Now, this is the old number 12. That's down at 3rd. That's on Clark Street between 3rd, or this would be 4th Street up here. 3rd would be down this way. That's a number 12 passing the city building, which was then the elementary school. It still had the tower and the bell. Many of you stood in that terminal many times. Dixie Terminal. Somebody can move that projector a little bit to get a little more of the picture. I think we're off to one side. First railroad train that passed through Dayton, 1888. That's when the C&O opened the railroad. That's better. This was our old Dayton Depot. That was, I don't know the exact date we tore that thing down, but it was there in the early 40s, I know, because I took a picture of it. This is our first fire department picture in 1893. They didn't have horses to pull it, they had the men to pull it. Just a hose reel. Now this building here, that's where the firemen slept. Now, this is in 1898, they had graduated, they have a horse and buggy this time. These two buildings are still there today. This was where they kept it. There's our first motorized fire engine, about 1920. That's Chief Kiefer at the wheel. Now, this is Juniper's building, carryout, Bill's carryout. This was the firemen slept in a little cottage next to it. Those are up for sale today. That's what they look like today. Same buildings. But that was our first fire department. That's the 1930 picture of the organization of the volunteers, Dayton Volunteers, 1930. And then we got a new fire truck in 1940. We only had one garage at that time. That's Chief Reinfelder and Bob Lamb, our police department. Now this is in 1898. This is the KFP building, or Carpet Place as we know it today. Knights of Pythias built that in 1885. Now that big building is 4 stories, and on the back end there's 4 stories, 3 stories here. And you know, most of you know the size of it. That costs, I have the original contractor's contract to build that for a total of $14,500. You couldn't put a roof on it for that today. This is in the council chambers on the 2nd floor. That's our city council in session in 1898. If you'll notice these 3 windows here, that's these 3 windows right there. They met on the 2nd floor. This is an early shot of the same building about the turn of the century. We hadn't gotten paved streets yet. We had the car rails, but the streets weren't paved. That's an early picture in the same building on the 1st floor. Mr. Mills had a grocery on the corner, and later it was called Beasel's Grocery. And then my father had a dry cleaning shop next door. And that's me right there. This is my father. This was my uncle, Ralph Stith. Some of you may have known him. This was a former mayor of Dayton, Walt Pilgrim. That's Walter Pilgrim. But I was 4 years old there. In that building. That's what it looks like. Well, they've repainted it since I took this picture. I got to get a more up-to-date picture. 6th Street Elementary School, that's where our city building is today, built in 1870. Before that, there was a frame schoolhouse there. That's an old picture of the city building. This is 1937 flood in front of the city building. That would be the Bank of Dayton at that time. Rifkin's shoe store is over here, Anna. And that's our city building today. The screen, if it was we were a little closer, you'd see the rest of the building. This is a Memorial Day parade back in the 30s. Some of these buildings, this was a saloon on the corner, Nelson Guy agent, or no, got it mixed up. There was a one-legged barber, Mr. Poland, who used to have a barber shop there. Nelson Guy had an insurance agency along there. Those buildings are all gone. Rite Aid is now where those buildings were. That's Rite Aid today. 1923, this was Schatzman's Garage and Delivery. Anybody know where that was? Yep, That's right, the old Kroger building, or what is now known as Riverside Market. That's Riverside today. This was 6th and Walnut, Johnny's Sweet Shop, Winter's Laundromat, Steidel's Grocery when my dad bought it in 1945. It's now an apartment building. This is taken in 1898. A fellow by the name of Collins had a grocery store there. That's what it looks like today. This is a building that is still standing. It's next to the saloon across from that building. Huddle's Cafe used to be called Smitty's Saloon or Cafe today. It's on the corner. They built houses all along Fifth Street behind it. There's houses on this side of it. That's the one of the finest homes in Dayton back in 1898. This building in the background is still standing on Walnut Street. It's right next to the Nazarene Church down there. That's the saloon on the corner, and that's the same building. This is a picture in 1911. Masonic Temple would be right about there. These two business buildings were on the front lawn of the Masonic Temple. The Masonic Temple was built in 1922. Prior to that, originally that whole corner lot went with this big two-story building, which my brother-in-law lives in today, Bob Williams family. And they sold that. It was sold off back in 1800s, and then it was sold to the Masonic Temple. But prior to that, it was a coal office and a delicatessen. That's what it looks like today. The overpass on Terrace Avenue. Now that's 1898, that picture. This building and the one next to it are still there today. You can see them there. They changed a little bit. This is 6th and Terrace, looking toward Bellevue. This would be the upper side of 6th. And on the corner was this building. Dr. Richard had his office in that building in the early part of the century. And what they did is they came along and put these porches on it. And they built this corner out also. You look back at it. They filled in this corner, and then they wrapped the porch around the side and the front. This is across the street, 6th and Terrace, looking down Terrace Avenue. That was Charlie Watson's Delicatessen on the corner. And Clarence Winters had the garage there where I think the Rusty brothers just bought that. They're going to be moving, going to have a garage there again. You know where that is? That's where the shoe store was, Ripken Shoe Store. This is 1898. Had one of the biggest cottonwood trees in town. They used to have picnics and boxing matches and everything underneath that tree. This old house back here in the background is still there today. It's on McKinney Street. That's what it looks like. There's that house. That was when it was Ripken's. It's now Millie's Drapery Shop. This would be at 6th and Dayton, and Cox's Drugstore. Well, it was a drugstore as long as I can remember. Deerstock had a drugstore there before White bought it out. It became White's. 1898. That was when it was Deerstock's drugstore. That was back in the 40s. And then White's bought it, expanded into that building. Now today there's a ceramic shop there. They're remodeling this building, still working on it. There's our $5 to $1 store. Yeah, we all miss that building, I know. That's where the health center is today. Now this was the Junk family shoe store in 1898. Now Joe Junk became quite nationally famous as an artist, and he and his wife ran this shoe store Joe, I think they said he was a little bit of a drinker. He liked to paint rather than run the shoe store. The wife did most of the shoe store part. But at any rate, he designed a recruiting poster for the federal government showing the blowing up of the Maine and Manila Harbor during the Spanish-American War. And he's the one that was commissioned to do that poster. And I have a couple of his paintings that he made during World War I that are 6 foot by 4. One of them's the size of a piece of plywood. And people left them, and I thought, well, they're not going to be destroyed because they're an important part of our heritage. That's what it was when Ann had a sort of a used furniture, used clothing store there. Don Ziegler had a law office there. Anybody know where that one is? Perry's Delicatessen? Who said that? Chili Park. That's Dayton Chili Park. That was Elmer Perry's relatives who ran the candy store and delicatessen. And about 1917, I think this was. This is what it looks like today. Chili Park. This is an interior of Getz's Drugstore in 1898. Now, Getz's Drugstore was what most of us know as Bauman's Cafe on the corner of 6th and Berry. Later became Froggy's Pub, and the last look, it was called the Long Branch Saloon. Closed. It was also a drugstore by the name of Thompson in 1911. I think the Baumans bought it about 1913 or 14. This is a picture in the 1920s. That's 7th and Berry. 7th Avenue Cafe, Robert's Cafe, whatever you remember it by. There's an old gas light fixture there. It was a street light. This is what it looks like today. St. Vincent de Paul, that's where that building was. That was Kuhlman's Saloon. Kuhlman, K-U-H-L-M-A-N. And then St. Vincent moved in there, and they had built a filling station on the corner. Those were all torn down, and now we have St. Vincent de Paul. What? Yeah, Kuhlman's Hardware, too, before Klinkenberg. This reason I put this scene in here, it's not a very good shot. This is the only picture I've been able to find showing the old Liberty Theater in the background. That's where the body shop is today. That was the Liberty Theater. They give away bags of groceries that you couldn't hardly carry home in there during intermission. Good popcorn. Now this was our honor roll for World War II veterans. That was where the Dairy Queen sits today. That was put up by the Lions Club, Dayton Lions. It had the names of all the fellows who served in World War II. Dayview Theater. That's when the Liberty closed, they opened the Dayview. This was at the corner of 6th and Dayton. That's the old State Bank building. This was a blizzard of 1918 in front of my office. Pretty good sized blizzard. This was Joe Bones Dry Goods, paper hanger, and later Martin's Drugstore. Charlie O'Day remodeled it into apartments. That's what it, and this was Henry Mextroth's grocery in 1898. That later was George Endicott's grocery. Tevis Delicatessen moved in there. It's been a little of everything. It's empty right now. Joe Beck's department store, right on the corner of 6th and Clay. Used to have the little pneumatic tubes, you know, where you put your change in and they'd race across the ceiling. When I was a kid, I used to go in there and watch them things. That's the strip today. See, that would be Martin's Drugstore, as most of us remember it. That would be Endicott's Grocery or Tevis Delicatessen. And that's now a preschool. But I understand the preschool is moving out of that, so that's going to be vacant. Here we are, the FW, Ashnot Center Tailor Shop. That's 1923. Wattie's, this was about 1920, Wadsworth Watch Case Company. Well, I don't know how that one got in there. That's the burning of the Island Queen at Pittsburgh in 1947. We're back to the beginning of that case. Okay, this was Teal's Cafe at 4th and Clay. No, they were at 4th. Musselman was at 3rd. Musselman's Grocery is at 3rd. This is Musselman's Grocery at 3rd and Clay. It was later called Gay's Grocery. This is the old Pastime at 3rd and Clay. That's what's replaced those buildings. We're standing here, we're at, what is this, 5th? Yeah, those are the, there's an aerial photo of Jamestown Village. That's Ben Osterhag's Saloon down on 3rd Avenue, which was later called O'Day's Cafe. Charlie O'Day's Cafe. But Ben Osterhag had it about 1900. That's when it was O'Day's there. Spears Hospital, 1898, brand new. And that's an operation. Dr. Garrison, some of you had him, I'm sure. That would be him right there operating. That's Dr. Garrison. If you notice, they're all bare-handed surgery, really different. Dr. Barnes' father. This was a famous Daytonian. He was a microbiologist and a doctor. He discovered the bacillus of tuberculosis 8 years before a fellow by the Frenchman by the name of Cook, K-O-C-H, got credit for it. But it's documented in the Cincinnati Medical College journals. He discovered, he didn't realize the importance of it, never made much to do about it, and the Frenchman got the credit for it, but he was from Dayton, Kentucky. And that was Spears in 1970, just shortly before it closed. That's Spears Court today. There's an aerial photo. Now that is the home of Washington Berry, one of the founders of the town, Jamestown. That's where the nurse's home is, or the alcoholic rehab center is today. That was Washington Berry's home back in the late 1800s. That's what replaced it today. That's the nurse's home. Lincoln School. Many of us went there. That's the new Lincoln. That's our first high school on A Street, built in 1904 and burned down in 1924. Looked a lot like the one we have that's up there today. But that's the day after the fire. The roof caved in and all the floors. What you see, that white stuff on the outside, is ice. It was a very cold January when that happened. The fire chief had resigned. They didn't have a fire chief. The fire plugs were frozen, most of them. So when they got there, there was very little they could do. They finally went back and got old Chief Keeper and got him out of bed and said, "Come up and help us and direct this thing." And he did. But there was no saving that building. That's the last high school that many of us went to on 8th Street. The old high end. That's the old high end. That was the hangout for everybody at school. The Zellers family owned that. This is our new high school. And that ditch is what we know as Davis Field. That was the beginning of our football field. And that was the dedication day of our football field in 1934. That was our custodian's car, Mr. Hebel. That's what it looks like today. This was our first one of the early graduating classes, 1900 class, and the lady in the front row here, that lady there, was Miss Cuppy. She taught at Lincoln School all her life, retired from there. There's one of our early football teams. They didn't have much in the way of uniforms, and for the longest time I thought, what's that hanging around their neck? Is that a piece of sausage or what? You know, I found out it was nose guards. These things hanging from their necks. This is one of the earliest pictures of a basketball team in Dayton, 1915 basketball team. That's the girls' team, 1918. Now there's that first night school graduating class I talked to you about. That's Felix Breitenstein right there. 1922. This was a debating class. Some of you know a lot of these two people. That's Daisy Wetzel, or Daisy Shear, now. This was, anybody know who that is? That was our famous librarian. Margaret Earl. This was a picture of 1925 debate team. How about that one? Sam the ice cream man. There he is. And this is Lou Blesh at the corner of 4th and Dayton. Now, that's probably the oldest residence still in existence today. It's on the corner, and the Matthews family occupies it. That had originally had log joist. And when people by the name of Lowry bought it and remodeled it, they dug the basement out, got rid of the log joist, put all new windows, and there's very little of the original structure left, but basically that's it. That's an old Stutz Bearcat in front. That's what it looks like today. These are four quite famous. There's 4 of them. There's another one over here. And that's at the corner of 4th and Berry on the lower side. Those have changed very little. This is in 1898, and this was Willie Parrott's subdivision. Bill Parrott built these. Today it looks like that. The only thing we lost was a little of the gingerbread around the porches. This is at 5th and Kenton, looking down Kenton Street. Anton Walker was the real estate developer at that time. He built all of these houses. And this was the old Niemeyer grocery on the corner. Blanche's grocery later. It's been converted into a dwelling today. There's what it looks like today. But those were all built in 1898. This is a house on 6th Avenue, right near Terrace, between Terrace and Vine, on the upper side. This was the only building, at one time it was the Emmanuel Baptist Church parsonage. I've forgotten the name of the people that live there today, but it's still standing there today. It was the only building in 1883 from McKinney Street to O'Fallon on the upper side of the street. Built in the 1870s. There's what it looks like today. This was the Shoe property, Joe Shoe. He had a rope walk on 5th Street right in front of his house. That's been torn down to make way for Belmont Place condos. 5th and Kenton. Is it Clark? I thought it was Benham. It's called Benham Place Development. Yeah. First Presbyterian Church, built in 1880. That's Reverend Irving, if you could see his top. Reverend Irving came to Dayton in 1879. He died in 45. He held the longest continuous pastorate of any pastor in the United States at the time when he died. That's the day after the fire. The fire, let's see, 1957, January. The church was organized in 51. First church was on 3rd Street, just a little east of Main. And then they came up there in 1880 and built that church. And it burned in 57. That's the new church that replaced it. This is the First Baptist Church of Jamestown. That's probably the oldest still standing structure in the city. That's Wing's Delicatessen, built in 1850. If you'll notice, it still has it had the curved church windows. There's what it looks like today. Still got the same curved windows, stuccoed over the brick. They added a little porch on the side here and took out the 2 lower windows and put in store windows. First Baptist Church of Dayton, built in 1898. This is a picture of it in 98 when it was brand new. You'll notice it has a steeple on it. It blew off in the 1915 tornado, and they never did bother to put it back. This is what it looks like today. Cost $25,000 to build that church, by the way. You couldn't buy one of the windows in it, the stained glass windows for that today. This is St. Francis Catholic Church. St. Francis was down at the corner of 3rd and Berry, or not 3rd and Berry, 3rd and Benham. 3rd and Benham on the corner, and it was built in 1852. Wiped out in the 1913 flood. This was the parochial school behind it on 3rd Street. This was the 1913 flood that wiped the church out. You'd see the church in the background. This would be about where 4th Street is. This is when they broke ground in 1914 for St. Bernard. And that's what St. Bernard looked like when they finished it before they put the front on. That would have been around 1920, I think. Oh, they did. Wonderful, wonderful. 1937, St. Bernard. Got in the basement, but it didn't hit the 1st floor. That's what it looks like today. Now this is across from the St. Francis Church at 3rd and Benham, where Bischoff grocery store used to be. And this was at that time called Runk's Cafe, R-U-N-K. And all the fellas, the girls would go to church, but all the fellas would go over here. This is St. Francis Cemetery in its heyday. It's a very attractive cemetery, but you go up there today, it makes you sick. You can't even find the stones. Maddox Distillery, what we knew as Tacoma Park was. The Maddox Distillery back in the late 1800s until about the 1920, when Tony Gesser bought it, turned it into an amusement park. That's Tacoma Pool in 1940. Now these were the marathon dancers. Any of you ever go to the marathons? Sure, heck yeah. 1934. These were the marathon dancers. They used to dance until they'd fall on the floor. You know, people would put bets on them, and they did everything. Now that's our marina. This is a 1937 flood shot of Dayton. This is the roller coaster that ran along Highway 8. That's this building here, that would be the dog track pavilion right here, this building right there. There's another picture, the dog track here, there's one of the roller coaster. 1937 flood. This was at Tacoma Park in 1926. They built this big boxing arena. They had some championship fights in that arena. Midge Gary was one of the big fighters that used to fight there. And then in the background, you can see the roller coaster. That's the roller coaster right there. Now this is a school teacher in Bellevue home. It was originally, this is in 1898 when it was called the White Camp Residence. But Mrs. Bergemeyer lived there for many, many years. The Brooks family occupies that today. That's what it looks like today. This was the Spillman residence in 1898 down on 4th Street between Terrace and McKinney. Hasn't changed a lot. And this was on 4th Street. This was the Mayor Reekers lived in that home during the 1940. Sandy Suker lives there today with her husband. This was a picture in 1898. There's a neighboring building with it. This is the Leeper residence on 5th Street, right near the Dayton Eagles. It has the big yard. Most of you remember that one. That was the Vogelback home. The Vogelback sisters lived there. The last surviving sister sold it in 1945 to Mr. Leeper, and the Leeper family has owned it ever since. They're both dead, but they left it to one of the boys who's a missionary to Germany. And he rents this building out. Now that's Alice Weaver? The Weaver family lived there. He was a real estate agent, and he lived on the corner of 5th and Clay. It looks pretty good today, same building. I think that's it. Okay. There might be a few questions you might want to ask. I don't know whether I can answer them all, but I'll try if you have any that you'd like to ask.
One side of the street would be Dayton and the other side would be Bellevue on a file area. How did they decide that?
Oh, that part? From O'Fallon Avenue to Washington Avenue in Bellevue, that was part of the original Taylor plantation called Bellevue, French word, B-E-L-L-V-U-E. And that was, Bellevue started at Washington Avenue and went to Newport. Then they sold that part off, and 4 of the sons of Colonel Taylor developed that area. All went by the name of O'Fallon and Van Vost, Ward, and Foote. They were all son-in-laws of Colonel Taylor, and they developed that area. And that's when Bellevue. I don't know how they arrived at the dividing line as O'Fallon. I've never heard that. That's a good question. I'll have to do a little research on it. Pardon?
In the library, they got that when his great-grandfather used to have a
Art, yeah, down at 4th and Boone. Yeah, in the if you're ever down at the library, if you look up the 1882 Williams Directory, it talks about a Mr. Berenson at 4th and Boone who made wooden shoes. Came from Holland, right, Art?
Well, I didn't think it was 4th and Boone. I thought it was up on the
No,
the only time
I've got.
his great-grandfather.
the only time that Berenson had a store was 4th and
Yeah.
Boone and my dad. Before that, well, before that, it was church.
I see. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you all. Appreciate it. You must be, you Bob Rufus?